Coming up next, Wallace. Coming up next, Aggie. Coming up next, Stuff. Coming up next, Stop. Coming up next, Wild Kratts. Coming up next, It's Arthur. Coming up next, Will and DeWitt. Coming up next, Maya and Miguel. Coming up next, Mixels. Coming up next, Kid Paddle. Coming up next, Edgar and Ellen. Coming up next, Little Ellen. Coming up next, Squidward. Coming up next, Mung Doll. Coming up next, Mystery. Coming up next, Malin. Coming up next, Snap. Coming up next, Happy. Coming up next, Grim. Coming up next, Gladys. Coming up next, Robot Toy. Coming up next, Little Toy. Coming up next, It's the Secret Saturdays. Coming up next, It's the Secret Show. Coming up next, Nora. Coming up next, Dora. Coming up next, Grim. Coming up next, Gladys. Coming up next, Grim. Coming up next, Gladys.